Hey there poetry pals, welcome back to another video. My name's Josie Alford and this week I am going through Amanda Gorman's poem and the only article I could find that said it was bad. Before we go any further into the video, please by all means subscribe to my channel. I make videos about all things poetry, so grab a cup of tea and let's get started. So here's how this video is going to go. I'm going to talk about my thoughts on the poem, my initial thoughts, and then I'm going to go into a little bit more depth on what made the poem so successful in my eyes, and then we are going to talk about the article. When I was watching Amanda Gorman perform her poem, The Hill We Climb, as I was watching it, it felt like this huge, amazing spoken word performance with traditions in American page poetry as well as stage poetry, and it had like traditions and reflections of iconic speeches throughout the years, and it had all of this intertextuality. Intertextuality by the way is when one text or piece of art references another text or piece of art. One of the things that I liked about her poem was that it was so easy to understand and accessible from the very beginning. The fact is that she wasn't reading this at a literary event. She was reading it at an inauguration that was going to be seen by millions of people all around the world and across her own country. So it needed to be a poem that people were going to understand, and tick, she did that. Also, my other thought was, she's 22. Damn. Then I went to Twitter after the inauguration, and generally the people I found on Twitter agreed with me. But of course they would, because I've curated a Twitter full of lefty liberal poets like me who enjoy spoken word. So of course my Twitter feed is going to agree with me, because that's how social media works. It keeps feeding you everything you want to hear and slowly drives you further and further apart. I saw a lot of tweets about people being like, to the people who didn't like this poem. And I was like, where are they? Where are the people who didn't like this poem? So I found this article in the Spectator by Melanie McDonagh, which said that Amanda Gorman was let down by a terrible poem. We're going to get to that in a bit. So one important thing to bear in mind when you're looking at this poem is that it was intended exactly for that moment at the inauguration, and it was intended to be read out. A lot of the techniques that Gorman uses throughout her poem are to do with the repetition of sound, whether that's through alliteration or assonance, consonants, the repetition of different sounds within words, or rhyme, which she uses quite a lot. There are also other rhetorical devices which are used throughout, for example, like lists of three and antithesis. Now, if you did GCSEs in the UK, you would recognise a lot of these techniques from the English language portion of your GCSE to do with writing to persuade, and this is where you write speeches. So when I say rhetorical devices, I mean writing techniques that can be used in poetry, but also can be used in other forms of writing as well. And that's the reason why I love this poem, is that it uses techniques that can be traditionally found in poems, but also techniques that are found in speeches as well. Another thing that is used a lot in this poem is anaphora. So anaphora is the repetition of a word or a phrase at the beginning of a clause or a line. I am not going to go into every single rhetorical device that is used in this poem, mainly because I want to focus on this article and explaining to Melanie where she went wrong in responding to this poem. So with that in mind, I actually found an amazing blog called Cass Morris Writes, where she went through line for line and listed all the rhetorical devices that are in this poem. And it If you're watching this and you're a teacher, or if you are a parent of a child who is homeschooling right now, go and find a copy of this poem, print it off, and play the game of trying to find all the rhetorical devices. Because at whatever age you start studying rhetorical devices, you will find it in there. From like really simple stuff like the alliteration, right up to the more complicated stuff. But the one thing I wanted to say about this poem before we move on to this article is one of the things that I find so strong about it is the way that the poem slips in and out of this huge relentless rhythm. So there are sections of it that have this rhythm that is coupled with a multi-syllabic rhyme scheme that is reminiscent of spoken word poetry, but also where spoken word starts melding with rap. There are moments of those coming in, and I really like those moments, and they are very strong and powerful, but then the poem will slip out of it and slow down and focus the listener or the reader on a certain moment, which I find incredibly powerful. Also, this poem is intended as the performance. We know that it is getting published as a book, but its first intention, first and foremost, is spoken word. And one thing that I found whilst trying to find a written version of it is that every version I found was slightly different, and it became clear to me that every version that I found online had clearly been typed up by someone else. And so when we go through and examine the poem, or when you do that, one thing to bear in mind is that every version I found online was different, so I don't think that we can get down and dirty with the special details like punctuation. We'll get into that, Melanie. Perhaps when the my copy of the book is delivered, I will go through it again and see. But yeah, that's something to bear in mind as we go forward. Let me tell you about this article I found. The title is that Amanda Gorman was let down by a terrible poem. And I was like, oh, was she? Because literally everyone in the poetry community that I follow online, both in the UK and the US, disagree with you, Melanie. But hey, I'm interested, tell me more. Bit of context for you. The Spectator is a right-wing magazine. And when I say right-wing, I mean centre-right. It's not like super-duper right-wing. It is also, fun fact, the longest-running weekly magazine in the UK, and it's been going for something like 300 years. Melanie McDonagh, or McDonagh, probably getting your surname wrong, Melanie, and for that I apologise, is a journalist who has also written for a few right-wing newspapers, so including the Daily Mail. Very interesting article supporting a teacher in Wales who got fired for talking in an inappropriate way about his students on a blog in their prom dresses looking like Kardashian clones, and she said that that was fine. But anyway, we're not here to talk about her other journalism, we're here to talk about her poetry criticism. In the opening paragraph, she talks about how Amanda looks. Don't get me wrong, Amanda looked amazing, but it's not relevant to the poem here, so let's get to the point, Melanie. 2 sentences later, she then says, I am not a literary critic. So, cool. So Melanie says that she can't understand the poem. She says that she understands bits of it, but that the rest of it goes over her head. She says, I couldn't make sense of it. I mean, I got bits of it. I got the sentiment. I got the stream of consciousness, the emotion. I got the sub-Martin Luther King flow. But trying to make the whole thing cohere structurally and grammatically and in terms of sense was another matter. I don't understand how Melanie didn't understand the poem. I think one of the strengths of this poem was being so easy to understand. But luckily, Melanie has gone through this poem line by line to show where she doesn't understand. So I'm going to go through Melanie's interpretation of this poem. I'm going to help you understand what it means, Melanie. Let's go. First of all, I do not think that this poem is stream of consciousness, like you've said. There is certainly long flowing bits, but I do not think that this counts as something that is stream of consciousness. If you want a good example of stream of consciousness, I recommend William Golding's Pincher Martin. As I said earlier, every single version that I found online of this poem was different, and the version that I downloaded and reacted to initially had different punctuations and different line breaks to the version that Melanie did, and I think this has led to a bit of confusion. My advice is to buy the book, Melanie, and when it comes, then decide. She carries on in the next paragraph and says, "I may be wrong." Yes, you may. She then says, "I may be willfully dim." And I have to say, Melanie, self-awareness looks good on you. And then she goes on to say that maybe this is how poetry works now. And let me tell you, right, I've got a personal bugbear when it comes to generations blaming the generations that come after them, being like, well, that's not how it's done. And yeah, poetry does constantly change and move, and what, you know, different techniques go in and out of fashion. But let me tell you, just because this poem isn't calling back to an English or European literary tradition does not mean that it is of any less value. And I would say that this does contribute to a spoken word and therefore an oral storytelling level of poetry, which is still a legitimate form of poetry. It's a legitimate form of poetry. She then goes on to have the entire poem with her own comments interspersed. So one of the things is the second line-ish. As I said, line breaks aren't clear, so the second line. She says, "How does the loss we carry, a sea we must wade, follow from the first line about finding light, unless it's simply to make wade rhyme with shade?" And what's interesting here is the punctuation in the version that Melanie's using. One thing that's worth thinking about is that poetry is open to interpretation and we each bring our own meanings to it. It might be that she was just using wade to rhyme with shade, but I'm not sure that's it. Here, I don't think the loss we carry is the sea that we must wade through. I think it is to do with the shade of the line before. I think we are wading through the sea of the shade of the line before. And I also think that the sea through which we must wade comes in at the next line, which is, "We braved the belly of the beast." To which Melanie responded, "Eh." Now, as I said, everything's open to interpretation, but personally, Melanie, if you're watching, I took this as a reference to Jonah and the whale. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned about Melanie yet is that she writes a lot about being Catholic, so I'd like to think she has a good knowledge of the Bible. And even if you're not religious and going to church, I think we all sort of remember the tale of Jonah and the whale. God tells Jonah to go somewhere. Jonah doesn't want to go, gets on a boat. Boat goes out to sea, big storm caused by God. Sailors throw Jonah overboard. Jonah eaten by a big fish. Stays in there for 3 days and 3 nights. Is spat up back on the shore. And then God goes, "Hey Jonah, do you want to go and do that thing I asked you to do now?" And Jonah says, yes. First of all, if we're going to critique anything about that line, it's that belly of the beast has become a little bit cliche. We've definitely seen it used before in multiple different contexts. But I would argue that the reason it's become cliche is because a lot of biblical references are. I got my Bible out, and this is the Life Application Study Bible, and according to this, the place where Jonah was supposed to be travelling, Nineveh, was a particularly morally corrupt place. The notes in my Bible said that it had overflowing prisons. and lots of other things that reminded me about modern day America, which just, if anything, contributes to why a reference to Jonah and the whale in this poem is perfect. So the next bit, which Melanie criticises, is this. Somehow we have weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken but simply unfinished. So she says that this is alliteration, which is correct. Weathered and witnessed is alliteration. But it doesn't mean, she says, that the two verbs make sense or work together. Now, I would argue that these two words, the two verbs of weathered and witnessed, are exactly why they work well together. We have seen this thing happen and we have survived this thing happening. The next bit is literally the line after what I just read, which is, we, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother, can dream of becoming president only to find herself reciting for one. Beautiful sentiment. This is what Melanie had to say. This is a weird sentence. You get the gist, of course, but where does the we that begins the line go in search of a verb? If the sentence began with, a skinny black girl can dream of becoming president only to find herself, it would sort of work. But following on from the we, the successors, it doesn't. Sorry. And here's the one point where I agree with Melanie. The sentence doesn't make grammatical sense. The subject, we, does not have a verb. Melanie is correct here. But what I am interested in is whether the finished published version will. Because this is a simple fix. If it simply said, we are the successors of a country, makes sense. It totally fits then. I am curious to see whether that will be fixed in the published version. That is the only time I agree with Melanie. Let's move on. I have to admit, this next section she gets really into on a line-by-line basis. So, Amanda Gorman writes, and yes, we are far from polished, far from pristine, but that doesn't mean we are striving to form a union that is perfect. Melanie says, what's with the but here? Maybe for are we not striving? I don't know. Well, she wrote, dunno. I responded, Melanie, here's where you're not getting it. The we in this poem is not striving for perfection. That is the whole point of this poem. The hill that the we in this poem is climbing up is not for perfection, but what they are striving for is answered in literally the next line, which is to forge our union with purpose. Not perfection, because that is impossible, but purpose. That is what they are striving for. So the next line in the version that Melanie found is separated by a full stop. Now, the version that I found was separated by a comma. So Melanie says, shouldn't it be a comma to make sense of the next infinitive, to compose? The line is, we are striving to forge our union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, blah, 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 blah. In the version I had, those two clauses were separated by a comma, which would make sense. In her version, it is separated by a full stop. So I guess, Melanie, what we're going to have to do is buy the published book and see which version's there. She didn't have anything to say about the gorgeous, gorgeous lines of, and so we lift our gaze not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. And a couple of lines later, we lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. So, then we have the line, let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true. Melanie takes issue with the word globe here, saying that Gorman should have used the word world instead. I argue that globe and world are essentially the same thing. I would argue that using globe in this line causes alliteration with the following line of even as we grieved, we grew. But also, globe feels like a more enclosed and united space, rather than world, which to me has this nebulous meaning, this wide open meaning, whereas globe feels more like one thing, one people, which I enjoyed personally. And actually, this isn't necessarily a word choice that I would have picked up on if it hadn't been for Melanie pointing it out, so thank you. Again, at this point, Melanie brings up the full stops. So again, I will bring up the fact that your version has a lot of full stops that you found online, Melanie, and the version that I found did not. Okay, we're going to move on. So then we get to, this is the section where she starts talking about it. We have seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. And this effort very nearly succeeded. But while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. Melanie says, this refers to the incursion of extremists into Congress, which took place while our poet was at work. But while the lines "we have seen a force" try for grandiosity, they collapse into the mundane. This effort very nearly succeeded. The lines don't hang together. I think this section, more than any other, and Melanie's opinion of it, is valid. I do disagree, and here is why. I think that by bringing down the grandiosity from the "we have seen a force that would shatter our nation" right down to "this effort very nearly succeeded," I think by doing that highlights the simple truth that something so small as a group of angry people almost toppled the whole thing. And it is simultaneously both this small, simple, mundane thing of a group of people who weren't happy with the election results, and this huge, big, scary thing as the threat to democracy. So personally, I think it works, but I concede that that is definitely open to interpretation. We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be. A country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free. We will not be turned round or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation, become the future. Okay. Melanie says that you could hear this being said as at a rally, but not in poetry. And I would argue that this section is one of the most poetic sections in it. We have some incredible alliteration. We've got some gorgeous lists of three. We've got that gorgeous anaphora of "we will, we will." This section is amazing, and it is powerful, and it is definitely one of the sections that will be quoted the most. What Melanie says about this poem being more suited to a rally rather than being a poem. Poetry and protest are fundamentally linked at its very core. I need you to understand that. Throughout history, poetry and protest are fundamentally linked. If you want to know more about this subject, I've got a book recommendation for you. This book is by Pete Bearder, and it's Stage Invasion, and it's all about the history of spoken word. I personally recommend chapter 3, which is called A Brief History of Democratic Literary Movements. And at the beginning of this chapter, Pete makes a reference to the 1819 Peterloo Massacre. For context, the Peterloo Massacre was when the cavalry charged into a crowd of 60,000 people who were protesting for parliamentary reform in the UK. In reaction to the massacre of Peterloo, Percy Shelley wrote the poem The Mask of Anarchy. Now, you might recognise a few lines of this because it has been quoted by a few other things. But this is a perfect example of how poetry and protest. I'm going to read you a section of this poem just because, oh, cracking. Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number, shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep have fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. So to be clear, protest, poetry, rallies, poetry, go in. If I could also reference anything else, I would totally recommend you to just YouTube Selena Godin and her performances at various protests over the years. Okay, next up. So then we have one of my favourite bits in the poem. If we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. Melanie argues that it should be changed to changes, so that so it should be love becomes our legacy and changes our children's birthright, as if love were the subject of this poem. Now, what's really interesting here is that Melanie seems really caught up in the, grammar of this, and I respect that. But I would argue that actually change, the noun, that change is a noun here. So love becomes our legacy and change becomes our children's birthright. That's what I think is happening here. I do not think that this is a grammatical error. Every breath from my bronze-pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. And she says that that doesn't work, which is true, it doesn't work, apart from if you watched the performance, Melanie, Amanda Gorman says, she starts that line with with. So it says, with every breath from my bronze-pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. The with makes it make sense. Just watch the performance, Melanie, it's right there. It's on YouTube, it's free to watch. Calm down, Josephine, we're nearly there. She doesn't have anything to say about the rest of the poem, at least line by line. So now we're going to just look at her conclusion, where she says, this kind of poetry and this kind of emotional declamation and all the intermittently dramatic diction are very much the stuff of contemporary poetry recitals. And let me tell you, that hurt deep, Melanie. That hurt real deep. Also, I don't think I've ever heard a poetry night called a poetry recital. Even the Page Poetry crew call theirs readings, but whatever. Also, Melanie, I fully hey, go to a poetry open mic. There is much worse poetry out there. Trust and believe. So then she says, but once you stop being uplifted by the authenticity of the emotion and the beauty of the speaker and actually try to get your head around the syntax and the sense, you just have to give up. I fundamentally disagree. I think this poem makes sense, but I do agree that the authenticity of the emotion and the beauty of the speaking and the performance itself, wonderful. She then goes on to talk about the connection with Martin Luther King's speeches, saying that Martin Luther King was an orator, not a poet. I would argue, hey man, isn't all of the definitions fluid? And I would argue that at least with some of Martin Luther King's speeches, we could call it poetry. I'm just going to say it. Sorry. She says that Martin Luther King's speeches made grammatical sense, but that the poem that Amanda Gorman performed didn't. And again, I just want to say that the version of the poem that you found online, Melanie, doesn't work, and it falls down compared to anything. But the fact is that I couldn't find online an official publication of the written poem. So I think where I have found the versions online, they are versions of the poem that different writers have just like transcribed from the performance, which of course you're never going to get. And so that is why I'm actually going to buy the book, so that I can see how the publisher and the editors have actually done it. She ends on this sentence: take the poem away from the moment of delivery and look at the actual text, and the hill we climb turns out, I think, to be just a bit rubbish. 1. This poem was the moment that it was performed in. The poem in its truest form is the moment that she read that at the inaugural speech, and to separate those two lessens it. Not because of the text itself, but that this poem was intended to be read. Secondly, what you were reading was not the actual text. And I encourage you, Melanie, if you ever watch this, why don't we buy the book together, have a little read and see if any of those issues are there. And if they are there, I'll admit I'm wrong. But Melanie, if those mistakes aren't in the final version, will you admit you're wrong? Throw down. To conclude, I think Amanda Gorman's poem that she read at the inauguration was an absolute triumph. I am proud that my art form was represented in such a way to so many people. And for that, Amanda, if you ever watch, I thank you. I think this poem was incredible. I think that it spoke to a lot of traditions, as I said, and I think that it paid homage to all of them. This poem is full of literary and rhetorical techniques, from alliteration and rhyme to rhythm and anaphora and lists of three and intertextuality. It references Hamilton the musical. It references the slogan of the country, and it references other political documents throughout history. It references the Bible. It references Obama's book that he released a couple of months ago. There are so many references to be found in this poem that I did not want to make a video just about those references because I was worried I would miss one. As I said in the intro, there is a blog that has gone through all of the literary devices in this poem. I'm going to leave that in the description below so you can read through it there, because it is so impressive how many she has packed into what is essentially a deceptively simple poem. Does that mean that there are things wrong with this poem? Yeah. I think it's a bit long. I think there are bits that could have been left out. I also realised that she was still writing this right up until the last minute. But all of those things are so small. You know, I think that if this had been intended as a page poem, it would have been a lot more tightened up. But it wasn't. It was intended to be read out, and I think it captured the moment perfectly. I love this poem. I'm gonna buy a copy of the book. I think you should too. So that's it for this week's video. Please comment down below your favourite line from Amanda Gorman's poem, and I will be back soon with another poetry related video. Maybe it's a rhymed sestina. Maybe we're going to look at alliteration. Who knows? Subscribe, turn on notifications. It helps smaller creators like me get found. And while we're on the subject, follow me on social media. I am Josie Alford Poet on all the things, and every day this year I am writing for 15 minutes live on my Instagram. So if you want to get involved and to start doing some free writing, be my accountability pal, then follow me on Instagram. If you found this video interesting or useful, by all means please share it, and if you want to show your appreciation in monetary form, I'll have a link down below where you can buy me a coffee. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.